Just a small footnote before the start of this episode. We recorded this conversation before the escalation of the protests against anti-blackness around the world in response to the murder of George Floyd by the 4 police officers in Minnesota. I've written a poem that I would like to share today after I learnt about the murder of a man by the people we are told protect us. The title is I Can't Breathe. Calling out for their mother's affection, grotesque infection upon infection, psychopathy in full swing. If Malcolm had a path, where is King? Shoot the children and the joggers, where did you get your bloody conscience? I cry out for the siblings left. I am tired now of murder and death. No accident, no mercy indeed. Assassinations with no courtesy heed. You held their necks in tolerant rage, an abusive father with no cage. Call for justice and freedom release. March the streets, a duty for peace. Smoky haze and pepper spray fill the lungs with atomic rage. Over and over, I can't breathe. When will this thing be over, please? I wonder why there is no distinct closure when these precincts still stand over. Funny how 2 colors come out of the rain to kill those that are not your race. It is the derricker, you see, the portrait of America's belief. We call for the killing of the root because we do not want strange fruit. Just how you cut the oxygen from our seeds, we will shut the weeds of racist police. Black Lives Matter. If you do not know what to do, firstly, donate to all organizations that are helping the cause. Minnesota Bail Fund, other protest bail funds, Reclaim the Block, Campaign Zero, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Black Lives Matter directly. Keep up to date with the current events, share information, not black squares. Attend protests if you are able to. Watch Black Lives Matter ad revenue streams online all day. Speak out, share, educate yourself. We also have to think about the injustices that occur in Australia to Indigenous people and people of colour. We live every day on stolen land, and still, since 1991, 432 Indigenous people have died in police custody. We call for reform and justice for the oldest people in the world, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Please donate and attend protests if you can. Bridging the Gap Foundation for Indigenous Health and Education, National, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance, the National Justice Project, Change the Record, ANTAR, Black Rainbow, Children's Ground, Change the Record, North Australia Aboriginal Justice Agency. And those are just some. I will leave more links in the description of this episode. Thank you, and may justice be served. Black Lives Matter. Stand for justice. Hi there, and welcome to What Are You Thinking About? The show where we ask the question and that dictates our conversation. My name is Aidan Prewett, and I'm a Melbourne-born and bred stand-up comedian, musician, writer, poet, and filmmaker. Follow me at AdamFreedom_ on Instagram and Twitter. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, Adam Freedom, and like my Facebook page. And if you love the podcast, think about becoming a patron. My guest today is Aidan Prewett. He is a music teacher, writer, documentary filmmaker, and Victoria College of the Arts alumni based in Melbourne. He is founder of Devil Blue Films, a production company that has been the catalyst for Aidan to write and direct documentaries centered around music, politics, and himself. His films are a meditation not only on subject matter, but have deep political, philosophical, and personal revelations. His short documentary, The Devil Blues and Me, from 2009 on YouTube, explores Robert Johnson, the man that sold his soul at the crossroads to be a blues god. It follows Aidan and his childhood friend Marty Singh as they explore the roots of the music they loved when they were children, before Marty starts his P.H.D. in Boston for atmospheric science on a cross-country tour of the South. Interviewing those who surrounded themselves by the blues, Muddy Waters drummer Willie Big Eyes Smith, and visiting the iconic Chess and Sun Records studios, the film tries to answer the question of what must we sacrifice to get what we want, And did the first rockstar really sell his soul to the devil? And are childhood friends destined to part like the basis of any good blues song? Then in 2016, he created his debut feature-length documentary, A Venue for the End of the World, exploring Woodstock and how audiences controlled through power, spirituality, war, performance, comedy, satire, leaders, groupthink, and art. How politics can be similar to performance and intertwined, specifically looking at Vietnam, the Nazis, and the counterculture movement. He interviewed Ian Anderson from Jethro Tull, Paul Provenza, Gregory Brothers to analyze modern satire through music, D.A. Penbaker, who directed Bob Dylan's Don't Look Back, Michael Shreve, the drummer from Santana, Dick Cavett, Ted Leo, Joe McDonald from Country Joe and the Fish, and Jan Klaus. He was then asked to write the book Woodstock at 50, Anatomy of a Revolution, which came out on August 10th, 2019, with interviews and perspectives on Woodstock. He is now working on 2 new novels for the 40th anniversary of John Lennon and the 50th anniversary of Jimi Hendrix, respectively. Welcome to the show, Aidan.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah.
How are you doing? That was a very long intro.
That's very flattering. Thank you. All good. All good here. How are you?
Yeah, pretty well. I think as much as I got used to isolation, I still feel like sometimes I need to get out of the house. But then when I do get out of the house, it still feels really strange. And I'm like, maybe I should go back inside. So it's sort of this contradiction. I'm like, I want to be inside, but I also want to be outside.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't really stay in one place. I'm always moving from inside to outside. But yeah, we met through a funny way. I had moved in my last year of high school. I had moved to a high school that I hadn't been to previously, and so it was kind of weird to be at a new high school for my final year, having to make new friends and everything. And I met you there, and you were teaching music. And I've attended some of your. I wasn't personally in any of your music classes, but I did attend some of your classes, and they're amazing. Just like how you connect with the kids, and just really understanding how to, as you say in the film, A Venue for the End of the World. That as being a teacher, you have some sort of power, and like manipulating people, but for the good, of course. You're teaching them. And I thought it was just beautiful. Everyone was playing instruments. I think you guys were playing Circle by Post Malone. And I loved it. And we just started talking about film. And so, yeah, it was really great meeting you. And it was funny sort of meeting you as a teacher and then afterwards, that sort of juxtaposition. It was like, we still talk the same, but it's funny that I met you as a teacher from a school I'd never been to. And I would have never expected a documentary filmmaker to be working there, and it was a really pleasure. It was really
How was that when I met you? I think we were like, was I on a yard duty or something? And
yeah.
Was that your first week at the school, or had you been there for a little bit?
I was there for a little bit, and then I think a month or 2 in, I was just walking around with someone, and you were on yard duty. We were just talking, and I had told some people I was into film, and they're like, "Oh, you should talk to Aidan." And then you brought up Woodstock, and then the first thing I said was like, "Yeah, a lot of people on LSD at Woodstock." And you're like, "Yeah, well, okay, this kid gets it sort of a little bit." It was good. It was a good introduction, and I'm very glad to have met you. And yeah, and now having looked through most of your work, I still need to read your book, Woodstock at 50, Anatomy of the Revolution. But your work is it's a lot about you and how you see the world, but also your subject matter is not only your subject matter, it's also everything else. It sort of circles around the world, but then comes back to you. And I find it really great. We're always going on a journey in your films. Like, I feel like it's always traveling through the USA. You know, you're going from LA to Seattle to Washington, back to New York. Yeah, and they're really fantastic. So anyway, let's get down to brass tacks. I don't know if that's how you say it, but so Aidan, what are you thinking about?
Well, I had to, because I listened to your other podcasts, which were fantastic, and I was like, well, first of all, I want to be on this podcast, but secondly, I got to think of something to say in response to that question that will make me sound like halfway intelligent. So, yeah, do you want to hear the response I've prepared to that question?
Sure.
Here it is. I've been thinking about the nature of story.
The nature of story.
Specifically, and if I can just circle back to Robert Johnson for a second, because the reason this like popped into my head was that about 3 days ago, I saw on my social media feed that a new photograph of Robert Johnson has recently sort of been unearthed, and I was immediately skeptical because I've heard this like in making that documentary 10 years ago about, or 11 years ago now, about the blues and following the story of Robert Johnson. I was like, there's no way. So somebody commented on the YouTube clip, because that film's up on YouTube now, and they said a new photo has just been discovered, and I didn't even click on that message because I was like, yeah, people pop up like 6 times a year saying that and it's always fake. But this one, I am 99% certain is real. It's come from a blood relative of Robert Johnson, and it for me it ticks all the boxes in terms of like provenance. It seems like it's the genuine article. But that got me thinking about the story of Robert Johnson and the legend of, because no one really knows that much about him. So the story of like, yeah, going to the crossroads at midnight, the devil shows up, then the devil reaches over and tunes Robert's guitar and hands it back to him. And suddenly Robert Johnson is this blues legend, and he's able to do stuff that no human being has ever done before. And then, of course, that legend helped to sell Robert Johnson as an artist. So it was like the PR machine, and he knew about this legend in his lifetime. Obviously, it grew since then because he died at the age of 27, like any good rock star. So he went on to, his records crossed the Atlantic and went to England and inspired the Rolling Stones and inspired Eric Clapton and John Mayall and the Small Faces and every other, British Invasion, I should say. All of those bands that then came back to and brought this sort of rock and roll blues to the States. It's this really interesting thing, but it's all sort of grounded in how do you sell a story, or how do you make a story that is that good that it sells whatever it's attached to. And in this case, that's music. It's kind of like if you wrap something up in a story and the story is good, it's going to travel.
It's that weird juxtaposition between sort of naturally being an amazing performer, but also having to be self-aware enough to actually sell yourself and sell your story. And I mean, just relating it, I guess, back to your films, there is that little personal connection, especially in The Devil Blues and Me, with your friend Marty Singh. Every time we try to tell a story, as much as we want to have something original and new, there will always be that sort of sense of trying to create a personal thread or create a story that tries to bring us further into what we're trying to look at. Maybe Robert Johnson never really gave that story. Maybe that story naturally came up, and then he saw it and was like, oh, I can use this to push myself into sort of being this mythical figure. I think my question for you would be, how do you think you approach subject matter and story? Because it seems like you very much get that personal sort of connection across very instantly. We get sort of the fruits of that near the end of your films, or during your films, really.
Well, it's sort of like, yeah, what kind of stories, for anyone who's trying to tell a story, what stories interest you, or what kind of stories do you want to tell? If you can answer that question for yourself, then you're pretty well set, because then you can go, okay, well, I'm going to delve into aspects of that and see if there's a thread there that nobody's pulled before, and try to tell that side of it, or uncover that stone that hasn't been turned over in that particular way. I mean, there's the old thing that goes back to, there's only ever one story. Every story is just that. It's the same thing. It's that old David and Goliath thing. Every story is that. It's like, here's a challenge that needs to be overcome, and it seems like it's a pretty big challenge. You can almost boil anything down to that. And then the question is, how are you going to approach it yourself, and how are you going to pick a story that? And so for me, I'm like, well, the stories that I want to tell have to do with it appears, if you look at the stuff that I've done, it's always music related in some way, which I'm open to other stuff, but it's like what resonates with me, because I'm not going to go and devote. I mean, it took basically from concept to completion of Venue for the End of the World, it was 5 years. And so the shooting process, we went to America and filmed over the course of, I think it was 7 weeks, and that was the filming part, and then it took 2 years to edit, in between, full time work and teaching and
Mm.
running the school musical and stuff. In between all of this, it took quite a while, but that allowed sort of it allowed everything to marinate and become some kind of a interesting stew of ideas, I guess.
And I feel like in the story that you wanted to tell, there is in the nature of story, we always talk about. I feel like the nature of story tells us that even though we can let something happen naturally, it's always going to come back to that sort of one story. Even though you could let something naturally arise, you can also force it as well, and both take sort of bring you back to a story. You can force a story, and maybe it's not the best story that you could possibly have, or it naturally arises but it's not the most interesting thing. But it's really special when someone can start creating a story and not really being forceful with it, but genuinely pushing it along to get those beats that a story has. Or you can have it naturally arise, where I feel like that's what happened with Robert Johnson. It sort of naturally arise that he was so good at playing the guitar. And I think someone in the Devil Blues and Me said that he plays the guitar like someone would play the piano. It's just putting the piano back onto the guitar. He was so good that there had to be some sort of story around him to justify him being that good, and that naturally arised. I feel like, and then it was sort of created into a fable and then into a legend. And I feel like if we track stories throughout time, we're always letting stories naturally arise in our lives. We tell the story of how, you went to the grocery store and someone cut you off, and then someone got angry with you, and then something was too expensive. We're always telling stories and we're letting them naturally arise. But I feel like with your work, you're letting some things naturally arise, but you're also trying to create a path for your story to follow. But I don't think you know what the revelation is at the end. Do you feel like you know the end of your stories, or do you feel like they sort of appear for you?
It's a bit of both, really. I mean, so with the two films that I'm most proud of being the Me and the Devil Blues and Venue for the End of the World, both shot in America. One had a script before I went in. That was Me and the Devil Blues. So I had that laid out on paper exactly the way I wanted it to be, and then we went and shot that, and came back. And of course, when you're interviewing someone who's like an artist and you want to get their opinions and stuff, you don't send them the script ahead of time. You might send them the questions ahead of time, but like they didn't care one way or the other whether or not this was like it's supposed to go in this direction, because you're just asking their what they think about something or what their experiences were. So I came back from the States and went to the edit suite and reviewed the material. And it was like, okay, this is, first of all, the script is kind of going out the window, because I know what I wanted it to be, but what we captured is so much better than that and went in so many more different, and there's more subtleties, and the things that people said are absolutely genuine because, it's coming straight from their mouths rather than in the scripting form, like what I thought they might say or things that I found in interviews from other times or whatever, like the just general
Mm.
beats that I wanted to hit. However, the ending was kind of pre-written because we knew that. So it's like a buddy. It's almost like a buddy comedy in that we're these two guys from Australia who don't really know anything about the blues. We try and play like the modern blues, or the like. We try to be a little bit Eric Clapton. We try to like cover Jimi Hendrix or Led Zeppelin or whatever, and generally do a fairly dodgy job of it, which hopefully adds to a little bit of comedy to the thing. By the time we get through to the end, it's like, okay, well, he's actually staying in America and I'm going back to Australia. So the friendship is kind of like it's put on hiatus. It's like it's a natural conclusion for the film. So that's very much, the through line of it is the friendship, and then the fact that it was going to sort of finish for a time. Happily, Marty's now, back in Australia after finishing his PhD and doing things with Harvard University and stuff, and now he's at Monash Uni because he missed Australia, which isn't that sweet?
Yeah, yeah. I think I think another thing that you sort of touch on in your films, you sort of have of obsession. We were talking about the 27 Club, so it sort of goes with Robert Johnson. He was the first sort of 27 Club person, and then you have the whole Woodstock crowd who are like legends of the 27 Club: Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, people of that ilk. And it's sort of, if we're bringing it back to the nature of story, I feel like there is that sort of tragic figure that comes out of the musical realm, the figure of someone who can play so well, but because they play so well, they have to have some sort of flaw, in internal flaw. It's almost like a Greek tragedy. Do you think that's a natural occurrence, or do you feel like you're drawn to those sort of people?
I have a bit of a morbid curiosity, definitely, in that. I mean, with the other film, Venue for the End of the World, there's a lot of like, I'm asking people about the Nazis and what's the deal with these giant crowd situations and everybody's on board with this? How did that come to be? What's the psychological manipulation of that? Yeah, I'm fascinated by sort of the darker recesses of humanity. And I mean, the fact that Jimmy and Janice and Robert Johnson all died at 27 is interesting to me, but I mean, every other artist that I enjoy, have either died at different times or they're still alive. So it's like there's nothing in it from that angle. But apart from the fact, does lend itself to being a good story. If you're in the the 27 Club, now including like Heath Ledger and Amy Winehouse, it's sort of like, oh, hang on, that my ears prick up a little bit with that, because again, it goes back to, I mean, well, with Robert Johnson, the devil. It's like, oh, really? Whoa, hang on. Where's this story going? We're talking about the devil now? That's like starting to get, creepy and a little bit, I mean, talking about the subconscious and stuff like that. There've been references to the devil or like a demonic Satan type character since forever. So there's some kind of subconscious thing that I think people prick up their ears a little bit when that comes up.
Mm.
And I know, yeah, it does for me, definitely.
They sort of, these figures sort of had the devil on their shoulder, like sort of a chip on their shoulder, that they had to get over. And I feel whether that's political or some sort of drug addiction or some sort of mental health issue, I feel like especially you picked up on, especially near the start of the film, The Devil Blues and Me, you picked on the politics of it. The blues music came out of the generation after slavery. They sort of embraced the devil as a figure to uphold, in the sense of, African Americans for generations have been called, the devil and repressed. And they sort of took on this figure of the devil because their music was quote unquote the devil music. So instead of being like, oh shit, man, we play the devil music, it's like, man, we play the devil music. Like I sold my soul to the devil to play this music. And it's sort of this beautiful thing. It's like, you would think the devil is a villainous character, but he's also a sort of sympathetic character, but he has that sort of flaw. And I think that's something really interesting that I feel like you explored in your film. All of these people came together to sort of play the music that was deemed unholy. I think in discussing the nature of how like people are villainized and they sort of reappropriate that vilification, what do you think it is about human nature that makes us villainize each other? And especially with a venue for the end of the world, I feel like at the end you really pointed out how easily you can villainize someone and how that can make a whole audience sort of react. So what do you think it is about human nature that sort of makes us do that?
Oh, there's so much subconsciously and even consciously. People kind of, when you go back to like the caveman days, you would see, I mean, because I've been there and all, it's a whole thing of like, what is it we as a small cluster of people living, in a cave or whatever need to survive? And one of the things that kept people alive in that situation was basic fear of anything, I mean, xenophobia at that time was a benefit to humanity. So it's like, if you're scared of the other or scared of difference or scared of change, all of that helped those people to survive. So on a base level, buried in our subconscious is this need to keep things the same, to not engage with people we perceive as being different, and in all kinds of in all manner of things to what is it? Basically, avoid uh, avoid change and avoid the other. And if there are things that you can point out as being different in other people, I mean, you see it in primary school kids. I certainly did. I had glasses in primary school. It's yeah. So I had that experience of being the other, and I took that on as part of my identity, and I still do to some extent. It's like I now see it's a source of pride to be like I'm very much different. There are so many ways in which I don't fit into the normal, like, homogenized society person. I don't do well with authority figures. I don't do well with following rules. Mind you, as I'm getting older, I'm getting better at that. It's something that I still like the idea of, being a little bit anti-authority, but I also I can see more value in that now in terms of like, well, look, specifically in this COVID-19 thing, the authority, being the government, is saying stay indoors. When they started saying, wash your hands and prepare for prepare for quarantine and stock up on essential items, and then you see the toilet paper goes missing. It's like you can see how, in terms of the toilet paper in particular, it's like that little germ of an idea that just fucked with everybody. And then the people who didn't want to go crazy and buy toilet paper started to do it anyway, because they were like, well, if I don't do it, I'm going to miss out. As a point, I did not stock up on toilet paper. I was like, I would rather retain a little bit of, dignity now, probably lose my dignity later, but at least if I run out of toilet paper, I will know that I was not following the herd. And I came very bloody close to running out of toilet paper. I think we were down to our last roll and a half. And then finally, in a service station, there was one last little roll, like a 12-pack in the corner. And I saw it and went, that is mine, and made a beeline for it and took that roll. But yeah, it's like the human need to homogenize things and make things safe. And of course, when the government said we're closing the schools, I was like, this is probably, I didn't want to buy into the fear, but by the point that they did close the schools, as a teacher, I was like, this is probably a good time to do that and to now stay indoors, and I'll keep my kids home from daycare, and let's flatten this curve. I understand the need to do that. I can see a rational reason to follow the herd and to follow the instructions of the government at this point. But I'm always, and I try to find a way to teach this at school. It's like you have to question authority. It's that Timothy Leary thing. If you've ever come across Timothy Leary, where he was a really anti-authoritarian guy, and just like he was all about LSD testing and all this sort of crazy stuff that I look at that and go, I'm not going into any of that either. But his ideas were really interesting. And one thing that stuck with me was this little acronym, and I usually hate acronyms, but this one stuck with me. Because again, acronyms are the born of Satan, and they pop up in every sanitized business that you'll come across. But this one is TFYQA, which is think for yourself, question authority. That pretty much sums up how I feel about any authority ever. It's like, just because they're saying something, you can look at any, the number of dickhead politicians has tripled in the last 3 years. It's fashion, and it's you can look at fashion and fascism and put them all in the same kind of box at this point. It's like people vote according to, I don't know, voters have short memories. I don't know, it's endlessly frustrating.
But I think it's interesting now, because with the COVID-19 thing, there has been a spirit of sort of anti-authoritarianism. A lot of normal people, or I guess homogenized people, just looking at them like they're crazy people, that they're going outside and protesting, being against the government and the lockdowns and everything like that, but sort of for the wrong reasons, being anti-authoritarian without any sort of point. In the sense of their point is, we need a haircut, but you're also risking public safety. And that sort of brings me back to A Venue for the End of the World, because Woodstock is the ultimate anti-authoritarian sort of a world history event. You know what I mean? It was during the Vietnam War. It was against Nixon. It had the same amount of people that were in Vietnam at the time, sort of questioning authority and a whole collective consciousness reflecting authority and trying to create change. You're always trying to explore, as you were talking about xenophobia before, you're also saying people are afraid of change, but you're obsessed with change. You're obsessed with Woodstock, and you're obsessed with the blues music becoming rock and roll and transformation. What draws you into change and exploring change, and especially through events like Woodstock or the creation of rock and roll?
I love that. That's an analysis I haven't like really reflected on too much, but I'm going to, because it's like, okay, that's a pretty astute observation about what I've done. The the thing is, and I have thought about the idea of like conservatism or being progressive. I mean, you look at those as being two polar opposites, or I do. I see that as being two polar opposites, and it's like to be conservative is to be perpetually disappointed. Everything. I mean, there's only two real certainties. I mean, three if you count taxes. So death, taxes, and change. They're the three certainties in life. And if you're conservative,
Mm,
you're only getting two-thirds of that. And then neither of them are good. To embrace change is so much more positive of an outlook
mm,
because everything does change. Everything's gonna change. Stuff that you take for granted now. I mean, look at like COVID. I mean, we were taking going and hanging out with friends for granted 3 months ago, and now it's like we're only just starting to lift restrictions on that. So I looked at this whole COVID thing as just a really interesting experiment, and hopefully we come out of it, not faring not too badly. Unfortunately, America, UK, Sweden, Italy, Spain, have really had an awful, awful, awful time, and I now feel guilty that I went into this going, well, this is interesting, as opposed to like, oh shit, no, this could really get to be a really awful thing, which it has done. We're very lucky here in Australia. I'm feeling gratitude every day for the fact that we have had a much better time of it than a lot of other places.
yeah, it's sort of when anti-authoritarianism goes too far, in the sense of like people want to be individualistic, they want to be free, and Woodstock was the epitome of that. But then they tried to sort of recreate Woodstock, especially at Altimo Free Concert. There was a tragedy. You pick up on that, where the Rolling Stones are there and they've hired the Hells Angels, and someone dies, and you sort of see the consequence of being so anti-authority. When there is no control, something could go bad. You talk about how people without leaders can sort of go astray, and there is this sort of groupthink that happens that can be dangerous and so manipulative. How do you think anti-authoritarianism can be too extreme? And and we're talking about COVID as well. How do you relate that back to COVID? What's your take on this whole, the government sort of shutting us in, we're losing our rights, this, that, the other?
I think, yeah. Well, if you're losing your rights but staying alive, I mean, I never really thought I was going to say something like this, but it's like in this case, it's true. It is worth sacrificing some of what you take for granted usually as being your rights to keep people alive. It's that has made me rethink things in this context only, really, because in general, if the government is saying you must stay indoors and you must not congregate as a group of people, when they brought the 500, when they said you can't have a gathering of more than 500 people, I was like, alarm bells are going off here. This is a little bit, this is the beginnings of totalitarianism. And then they brought it down to 100. Then they brought it down to, it became 5 people, and then it became 2 people. And then it was like, you're only your people you live in that household with. And it sort of, the only time I questioned it was when it was initially 500 people. And I was like, there are things that governments can start to push through when you're not allowed to protest in a group of 500 people out front of the Parliament House. And that, when you look at what has been going on with Dutton and some of the other dickheads, there are things that have been pushed through and that they've been able to do that they wouldn't have been able to do if public gathering without any spread of disease was possible. So it's a double-edged thing. I actually interviewed right before the proper sort of lockdown, when they closed the schools and stuff, right when it was still about, I think, a gathering limit of like 100. I interviewed Bob Brown, who was the leader of the Australian Greens Party for many years, from its inception, basically, until about 2014. So he was a senator for a long time, and knew all the people in Canberra and was involved in some huge, big, important changes in Australia. And he also, the reason I interviewed him was that he was the doctor that admitted Jimi Hendrix's body to hospital in London. And so I did the interview with him talking about Jimi Hendrix and what state Jimmy was in when he arrived at hospital. And Bob said he was very clearly dead, and that meant that he was continued to move. So he didn't spend any real time, more than about a minute, with Jimmy's body before it was wheeled off to the morgue. I had to ask at the end, because this was like going into lockdown, what's your take on this whole COVID situation? Bob said, yeah, basically this is a situation that we've got to take seriously. The spread of disease, we've always known that large gatherings can spread disease, and so if there is one going around, then we should isolate as much as possible. And I was like, this is one of my heroes, and a real anti-establishment figure. I mean, he's not anti-establishment, but he's very because he was part of the government, but he's very much a progressive guy, to say the least. And he's been arrested for preventing logging and stuff like that, like standing in front of bulldozers and like he's a serious guy. And when he said that, I was like, he's not even questioning the idea of whether or not these gatherings are because protests that he's led have counted in many thousands of people. So he understands the power of that, but also he's really weighing it up. Within a few days of that, I got an email from Bob's foundation that he runs at the moment saying, we're going to do a march on Canberra, but it will be a digital march, and we're going to upload video of us protesting in our homes. And I was like, so he really gets it. He gets that change is always going to happen. And it's like, we just need to adapt and figure out how we can use the things we're doing well now into new situations.
Yeah, it's a tricky balance between sort of authority and how much authority you need and how much individualism you need, and that healthy balance between sort of crowds. When you have a crowd, it's so easy for it to go hostile or be fully at love and with peace with each other. There is that firm balance, especially with protest. It could be a peaceful protest, but a peaceful protest can turn into a violent protest so quickly. Yeah, it's a strange phenomenon. How do you think these political sort of nuances affect the nature of the stories we're trying to tell? Because I feel like you do not always have a political angle, but are aware of the politics in the story. And how important do you think politics are in a story?
One of the things I love to do is just to flip things upside down and see what happens, shake them a little bit and see if something falls out. So to subvert something, the word subvert is like flip it, to change it, or to to flip it upside down. That's important to me. I enjoy anything that is done in a humorous way to do with being a little bit subversive, which is why I interviewed the Gregory brothers with their, auto-tune the news, doing, making Joe Biden sing, which is now, that was, years ago, but now Biden is back in the spotlight. So him being an excellent unintentional singer is quite a wonderful thing to me. That is a real draw for me. Anything that will pick something up and examine it in a new light and hopefully make fun of it a little bit, to make it interesting, to grab people's attention, and to say, that's what Paul Provenza was talking about in the Venue for the End of the World, where he says, comedy is that it's the person out the front of the comedy club with the sign saying, "Come on in, we're gonna have a good time tonight," kind of thing. Comedy invites you in to laugh, and then we're seeing more and more, it's become a very popular form of comedy. I mean, I saw Will Anderson on the Australian lockdown comedy special the other night. He was saying, yeah, he like Anderson didn't hold back. He was like, yeah, like Scott Morrison, you're a dickhead. And I was like, this is the Will Anderson that I know and love. And usually I do. Like when you look at what Will Anderson has done throughout his whole career, he's all about just twisting things and changing messages and poking fun at things in a slightly dangerous way. Sometimes, to his own detriment, because making fun of political leaders in a fairly abrasive way is not always a smart plan. But I admire him for doing that.
Yeah, you've touched on sort of the power of performance almost, how much power that has. And I think especially in your documentary, you sort of how powerful performance can be in the eye of government. How satire works. You were talking about the Gregory brothers and Auto-Tune the News and Paul Provenza, talking about how comedy can manipulate people, make people think about doing the right thing. He was talking about putting the women and children at the front to sort of confront people. And there is that sort of balancing act when it comes to that. What do you think it is about the nature of performance, and especially being at the center stage of things, that can make people understand the story of, oppressed people, or understand the story of teachers that aren't being paid, or understand the story of trying to create a counterculture movement? What do you think makes performance, especially music and comedy, so powerful to do that?
Well, it depends on how it's used as to the power of it. But I think that it's very much like, if you attach something to, I mean, you could look at story and you could look at song, and those two things that have resonated throughout human history as being these things that bring people together around a campfire. People would sing around the campfire. People would tell stories around the campfire. That's built into all of us. Our DNA is constructed with kind of this attachment to story and song. The fact that if you attach something to a story, or if you attach something to a song and you put it out there in the open, people are more likely to resonate with, or have that resonate with them. And so those messages can be repeated and repeated and repeated. I mean, Bob Dylan's songs still now, like 55, 60 years after he wrote some of his greatest protest anthems, are still around and are still resonating, and people know them. They can whistle them, or they know the gist of it, the times they are changing, that kind of thing. Teenagers often will have come across that somewhere, and they'll go, hang on, what is that? I've heard that somewhere before. Before I even knew who Bob Dylan was, I was well aware of the song Blowing in the Wind, because I'd literally heard that around the campfire with family, friends and stuff like that, and not having any concept of what it was about. So these subconscious little connections that we have are really powerful, and it does kind of it's welcoming for people to attach to things that are easily repeatable and that have this message somehow attached, but the message is not necessarily front and center. So comedy works in that way. Stories work. I mean, comedy is storytelling. It's one of those that's basically when you are up on stage doing your act, it's usually a series of little stories. It's very easy. I find it so easy to watch a stand-up comedy special on television and just like absorb it. It's relaxing, it's comforting, and it doesn't matter so much what it's about, unless, mind you, I have to say, the new Seinfeld comedy special on Netflix, I sat there and I watched 20 minutes of it. And then I was like, okay, I'm actually going to sit up and listen to what he has to say, because so far I'm only hearing normalcy in this homogenized society kind of thing of like, he started talking about like how couples always fight and stuff like this. And I was like, we're in the middle of lockdown, and Netflix is releasing this thing that is like normalizing, bickering couples. And I was like, is it that common that people are really like going, because it wasn't really, what he was saying wasn't really funny. It was just like, if you've been there, you would relate to it and go, haha, I get this. But I was like, this doesn't ring true for me. And I wonder, and I hope that this isn't like giving permission for people to go, well, I'm in a shitty relationship, but Jerry Seinfeld says that's normal. So I'm cool with that. You know what I mean? Like I actually felt by the time he finished it, because about 20 minutes in he started doing that material and he got through to the end of his hour and wrapped it up without any real, like, I don't know, there wasn't much art to it. I was offended from the based in the fact that I really liked Jerry Seinfeld. I loved the show, and I've seen him do fantastic stuff, and I love comedians in cars getting coffee because like that sort of does kind of what we're doing here, just shooting the shit and talking about ideas, which he does so well with that. And he's a smart guy. And then suddenly he's up there doing this material that sounds like someone wrote it for him in the voice of Jerry Seinfeld and he's regurgitating it. Second of all, the world is going through some serious shit right now. Just talk about this mundane shit that could have been in a comedy routine from 40 years ago. And third of all, he's normalizing like almost, but not quite, being an apologist for like domestic violence, which of course in time is a serious issue.
100%.
It's yeah, I don't know. I turned that, like I watched the whole thing just to try and analyze what it was that was going on. And I think I understand it. I think he was like, I want to go down the road and this is pre-COVID. I'll go out on the road. I'll do a couple of shows just to stretch my legs and see if I can still do comedy in front of an audience. Do I still have it? But you know what? I can't be bothered writing my own material. I'll do some of it, and then I'll do 5 jokes and I'll send those off and get some writers to do the rest for me, and I'll just sort of go with it. And I don't know. I'm on a rant here, but I was just
there was a lot of controversy around that French gay king bit that seems just like so out of place nowadays. Like when I saw it online and people were saying like Jerry was complaining that people weren't finding it funny, it's because the times have changed and he hasn't changed with the times. And I think that's sort of the danger of, I don't know, my next question was going to ask, do you think it's more powerful to have someone who's performing or at the top of the person in the center of the stage more than the protest or the Occupy movement? Do you think it's more powerful to have someone at the center of it? Which I think it is more powerful, but it can be dangerous. Like we were just talking about Jerry Seinfeld. He's going about it the wrong way and everyone's still looking at him. And so it's kind of that, yeah, it can get into dangerous territory when the manipulation of an audience isn't for best reasons. Just trying to get a cheap laugh from some homophobia or trying to get a cheap laugh from, as you said, maybe giving people the right to bicker and normalizing bad relationships and toxic relationships. How do you feel about a performer? What do you think is the nature of performance and how it can be used for negative purposes or purposes that are reductive or regressive?
Yeah, well, it's like it comes back to whether it's conservative, which I think that Jerry's routine was absolutely like stuck in the 80s. And it's like if there is a person, I mean, okay, so let's use John Lennon as an example, because I've been writing this book and interviewing lots of people who knew him and trying to collect their stories, basically, because it's like a biography is one thing and it's very linear and kind of tells you about what the person did and when. But I'm more interested in story, which is why I was talking about that. And John Lennon was hounded by the FBI trying to get him to leave the United States because he was this cultish figure and become more so ever since 1962. He's just grown as this legend. And so in the early 70s, he moved to the US trying to look for Yoko's daughter, who had sort of went off with her actual father, but cut off contact with Yoko, and they found that very distressing. So they went looking for her. That's why they moved to America in the first place. Basically, as soon as they got there, the Yippies, who Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin, really like glommed on to John, it's like almost as soon as he got off the plane, and were like, "You're one of us. You're anti-authoritarian. Come and hang out with us." And so he did spend a lot of time with them in the first couple of years. Now, the FBI was already watching them because they had the Chicago 7 and crowd violence in the Democratic National Convention in '68, the whole thing. And so because they were such closely monitored public figures, and now with this legend of this popular legend, like an act like one of, a real pop star, suddenly you put those two things together being these, I mean, the FBI looked at the Yippies as being terrorists, really. They didn't actually set about to get anybody hurt. But they knew how to manipulate the media, and so they, when they were connected with John Lennon, it was like this almost a triad of pain for for the U.S. government. And Nixon, Nixon was well known to really dislike John Lennon because he came with this message of love, and he came with these great songs, and he also came with, I mean, it was a fuck the police kind of situation, like what NWA did 20 years later. It was very much like, no, stand up, be counted, give peace a chance, and power to the people. And we deserve better than the government that we have currently. So they tried to kick him out, and it was about 6 years of court proceedings before John Lennon finally could take a breath and go, oh, all right, they've granted me permanent residency now. Like they were tapping his phone, and they were trying to intimidate him by like following him very conspicuously. Yeah, so it was a really interesting thing, but he was a figure that they were scared of because he could be this figurehead for a movement. And he actually sort of parted ways with the Yippies once he realized that the FBI were getting involved and were going to, mess up his ability to stay in the country. But he didn't ever return to England. He was there for about 6 years. He was in New York for about 6 years and was unable to, and he went to LA and stuff, but he was unable to leave the country because they just wouldn't let him back in until about 1976. And then at that point, he was kind of like, okay, I'll do some traveling, but I'm not ready to go back home yet. And he never ended up back in England or Liverpool. There was a phone call that he made to his aunt Mimi a couple of weeks, or maybe just a week before he died, where he was talking about, I'm going to come back and we'll have a reunion and do this whole thing. So yeah, it's like these figureheads are very feared by the establishment. But if you take someone like Jerry Seinfeld as being somebody who can get up in front of people and they will follow his every word and they'll laugh where they're supposed to laugh, that in itself, I mean, I'm not going to be a conspiracy theorist and say that Jerry Seinfeld was paid to do shitty material, but it's almost like he was just falling back on comfort food. And I would rather, in a selfish kind of way, that someone who has that kind of presence use it for the purpose of what they believe in politically. And hopefully that would mean being progressive. But obviously, and there are stand-ups. I mean, most stand-ups, and the ones that I know definitely are progressive people. I mean, Will Anderson is top of the list for me. And obviously Paul Provenza, fantastic stuff, and is always sort of poking the bear and getting a response. It's very much a question of, once you've got this power, what do you use it for?
You do explore the Nazis and Adolf Hitler in your film, and sort of the parallel between Woodstock and massive rallies, those massive Nazi rallies. And one of the people you interview, Chip Monk, he was a really big fan of Albert Speer. And yeah, it's just like, with that great power does come responsibility. Albert Speer was able to create, those beautiful structures, and he was such an amazing designer, but he was, as Chip Monk said, he was just on the wrong side. It can either go left or right, and I think sometimes it can also get manipulated as well. Performers can get manipulated, for like you sent me this podcast, The Winds of Change, which was so interesting. I was listening to it so much, and there was this point where they were talking about Nina Simone and how she thought she was going to Lagos, Nigeria for her own sort of spiritual sort of journey. And it was a front for the CIA, so this performer, this amazing political performer, was manipulated. And so how do you think that changes dynamics of one story when the government or other people try to take away the power from the performer?
It's really like, I found that podcast to be like, I was addicted to it, and I churned through it in a couple of days. And that's what I was trying to like hint at there with Jerry Seinfeld. It's like, well, these other performers, it has been revealed over history, people like Louis Armstrong as well, who were sent on these goodwill tours, but it wasn't really a goodwill tour. It was the CIA fronting this thing to advance American interests. It's the stuff of conspiracy theory, and I try to be as skeptical as I can. But when the CIA has released documents from that time period that confirm it, it's like, oh, maybe Jerry Seinfeld is a CIA. Yeah. But it's like, it's just, it's promoting with Nina Simone. She's out there doing a tour of these countries, and the CIA looked at it as being, okay, we're going to just like export American pop culture to the world, because prior to World War II, America, or actually no, earlier than that, prior to Hollywood, America was kind of not seen as this cultural utopia that it kind of then created for itself through Hollywood. And if in that sense, you can kind of look at early Hollywood films and then all the way through to in the podcast, he even talks about like Zero Dark 30 as being CIA propaganda, which that movie in particular absolutely is that. I mean, I look at Iron Man, the first Iron Man movie, I saw that was released at the height of the Iraq war, when things were still going on and still would like this is like 2008, and so things had been taking like a downward turn since forever, and that movie came out, and I just looked at it once and went, I can't even believe I'm still sitting here watching this, because it is just absolutely villainizing anybody of Middle Eastern appearance. It's the same thing that as creative people and filmmakers, as you and I been doing, it's like, shouldn't, and I guess that's a bias, but like, shouldn't art be trying to like avoid being propaganda? And then, of course, there are people like Albert Speer who are fantastic artists, but they don't care what message they're portraying as long as they get to get their art out there. And it's I see that as being evil in the absence of goodwill. It's like, if you are that much of a sociopath that you don't see how, or you don't care about the fact that your art is being used to further the ideals of Adolf Hitler, then that makes you by definition evil. And I mean, he did he did 20 years in Dachau prison with other war criminals for his part in that. Like, so yeah, people try to pass Architect for the Nazis as being this kind of, he was on the wrong side of the fence and he just did what he had to do. I would, if I was an incredible architect and Adolf Hitler knocked me on the shoulder and said, bring glory to the Third Reich, fuck you. Send me to do what you need to do. Send me off to like Sachsenhausen, whichever political internment camp you want to send me to. If it means that anyone's going to die, let alone 6 million people.
It was so funny to learn through your documentary that Mick Jagger got Leni Riefenstahl to do portraits of his wife and him. It's so funny when, these people that are proponents of change and things like that are cohorted or sort of taken over by governments, and it's so funny. While you were talking, I was thinking about how the American government's story, they love to have this story of like, we're for freedom of expression, we're for everyone, equal rights for everyone. But then sort of backtracking during that whole history and trying to rewrite history. They had Jim Crow. They were arresting people for LSD and marijuana, the war on drugs. And then they try to sell all of that trauma that they've caused back to the world, and it's sort of this weird thing that happens. But I think getting back to it, I think you're touching on the responsibility of the artists, not only politically, but also for the benefit of humanity and understanding how much power an artist has. Even if you do have a small audience, you might be, as a comedian, I play to like 20 people in a room. I'm more aware of those 20 people than ever before, and my responsibility as an artist to bring out the best I can artistically, but also be aware of them as people. As much as we love to say, oh, I don't care about the audience, I make this for myself, you still do have a responsibility, I feel. And just about Albert Speer and Leni Riefenstahl and all these people, that amazing artists, but they didn't take their responsibility properly. This power that they had, they just sort of let it be taken away from them.
They allowed it to be dictated for them, and they didn't care about the direction that it took. I mean, Leni Riefenstahl, went on to almost sort of be an apologist for well, yeah, she like was a highly revered artist up until I mean, in the 70s she had a comeback and was like around the time that Jagger hired her, she was like doing all kinds of crazy stuff, going to Africa and photographing like the trying to think of the name of the Maasai people, and coming back with photographs and saying, look, I was always just obsessed with the aesthetic of things. I don't care about a person's race. I care only about the aesthetic. I was like, but isn't that kind of like, that makes you a sociopath? If you can't differentiate between like what you're doing is aiding in creating suffering for so many people, and then you come out of that, and Leni Riefenstahl didn't do any jail time. She sort of reaped the benefits of that and had this reputation that preceded her wherever she went, and people kind of went with it. Not everyone. People like Susan Sontag really let her have it, but
I like how you brought up Susan Sontag and how we need to sort of keep performers in check because they affect culture so much. I think just to finish us off, I want to just bring it back to the nature of story, I guess. And we did talk about politics in story, but I wanted to get your opinion on why do you think we focus on icons in stories? Especially the stories you tell, you definitely focus on, the rock star or the performer. So instead of Hercules, David, and Athena, we have like Jimi Hendrix, Robert Johnson, and Janis Joplin. Do you think we have stories like these nowadays? Do we have icons that can affect culture so much? And why do you think these people specifically affected culture?
When you look back to the ancient stories and the Greek mythology, most of the modern stories they're based in that. I mean, my favorite being the Minotaur. That one pops up so often, and often that is an iconography thing. Like it again, with Star Wars, you look at the Rancor in the dungeon, and it's like, well, that's the Minotaur myth. It's the same thing. Got to find his way out somehow. It's obviously a short thing, but that flash of that iconography is very strong, and it does work on that primal kind of level, going all the way back to the stories we're told as little kids or nursery rhymes and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's very powerful, that stuff. In the book, actually, the Woodstock book, I liken and this might be like a little pretentious, but I do liken the creator of the Woodstock Festival, a guy called Michael Lang. He was this cherubic guy. He was about 25 when Woodstock happened, and he kind of just snowballed it into this thing that was this huge festival that nobody had ever seen anything like it before. And he was this kid at the center of it. And it was kind of like he was unwittingly entering the Minotaur's lair, because once he was there, trapped in the middle of it, of 456,000 people in this field in upstate New York, how the hell was he going to get his way out? And that's like metaphorically as well as physically, because the Woodstock Ventures business, there were several businesses connected with it that were bankrupted over the festival. The entire festival lost so much money for so many people, and it took 10 years for the actual Woodstock Ventures company to buy its way back out of effectively what was going to be bankruptcy for them. And as a symbol, I mean, that dove on the guitar, the neck of the guitar, that is an icon in itself. That icon, was very, very close to just being a bankrupted company. And I mean, the festival that was supposed to happen for the 50th anniversary, that just fell apart. At the time, that symbol, the icon, the dove on the guitar of like, celebrating peace and music, is it sort of was a little bit tarnished with that. But of course, it was in the 90s too. The 1999 Woodstock was an absolute disaster on the level of Altamont. It is interesting how these symbols that can be drawn from, I mean, the dove in itself, the level of symbolism of that, there's definitely like religious iconography going on there, and it's all subliminal, but we connect to it. I think it's likely enough that in the future we'll look back and go, oh yeah, so and so was kind of the Jimi Hendrix of the day or whatever. Hendrix himself wasn't that politicized. He tried to steer away a little bit from that because he didn't want to limit himself based on an ideology, I guess. Whereas John Lennon was much more outspoken. So I don't know who those people would be right now. It's very difficult to pinpoint them. But I have to say there's a bit of The way that the culture has sort of evolved to this point is that when I say they, it's like the corporate machine that builds, publicity for so many things, likes to compartmentalize and simplify things. So it's like if you're a pop artist, that's what you are. That's the label that is on you as, as Taylor Swift. Like, it's difficult to be anything more than an entertainer if you are even of someone of that level of fame. I find it difficult to see how people would be seeing Taylor Swift in a political light in the way that we would look back at John Lennon as being, leading marches and stuff like that, which he did do occasionally. And this is the other thing in terms of compartmentalizing what a person does as their contribution to society. So Taylor Swift is music. She's pigeonholed as that, even though, I mean, she does do. You see that she had a whole thing with Spotify, and she was standing up for artists not earning money and stuff like that. So that, but she's not going to be remembered for that. And then you've got Greta Thunberg, who is standing up and is doing everything possible in her power. I mean, I don't think she takes a break for standing up for, like, let's do something about climate change. It would be good to see more people doing that. So I mean, I look to her at the moment as being an example of somebody who is an icon in their own time and is doing stuff in an attempt to better society. And to see all these grumpy old men getting angry, which, I mean, when you say grumpy old men, I mean, I've spoken to quite a few, friends of John Lennon's recently. Everybody who was with John back in the day is currently with Greta Thunberg. I'm very happy to say. I don't think there's anyone I've spoken to that hasn't, referenced Greta in a really positive light. One or two of them went so far as to say, yeah, she's kind of the John of this era. And if she sang songs, then that may well be the case. But it's like John was able to sort of span the expanse of, I mean, artistic expression and politics and bring it all together. It was seen as dangerous by the political authority. And, looking back at that makes me feel very happy to have had John Lennon in this world at some point. I was very enthusiastic about 10 years ago about the possibilities of the internet and social media and all of this. And then, of course, that's completely gone the other way. But I'm still I want to remain optimistic that we are continually fed this idea that people are apathetic and complacent and like just looking after their own interests in the here and now. But I mean, the media can't ignore, as much as so much of the media, especially the Murdoch media, would love to just ignore the climate marches. That has shown indisputably on a level like larger than Woodstock. Some of these crowds are just phenomenally large in and closing down city centers because of these waves of people coming through. And the age of the people who are waving the placards, I find that completely inspirational. And I think it points in a positive direction of that, even though consistently the media is trying to cram this message down our throats of like, just, it's basically saying give up. Like, don't even bother trying. It's not worth attempting to, stop the damage that's happening to the environment. Either it's already been done too much, or there's no way to stop the machine. It's hopeless. That's bullshit. And the kids are showing us that it's bullshit. And that is that to me is more inspiring than Woodstock. As much as, Woodstock has inspired me as a person to push for change, I can see so much more of that evident now. It's just the way that it's covered by the media, whitewashing it and making light of it. Whereas in the 60s, the media hadn't quite switched on to this idea that, like, if there is a paddock with 456,000 people in it, that's news. So we'll cover it, and we'll cover it in such a way that, it's actually done in a positive light. If that happened today in this same exact fashion, there's no crowd violence, everybody's getting along, peace and love, Jimi Hendrix is there, it would still either not be covered at all, or it would be, these kids should be at school. They're missing one day. It's a day of school that they should be in there learning. Well, how about we, don't alter the history books to completely whitewash Australian history? We don't pretend that the current way that white people are living in Australia is not because of these unfortunate 300 years of completely uprooting a way of life for well over, for generation upon generation upon generation of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters. So I'm just always frustrated with the hypocrisy of government and the hypocrisy of the media. I find solace in the kids that are marching, and I find solace in the people who are speaking out. I view that as hugely optimistic for the way that things will change and come about. And at the end of this COVID thing, there will be changes of some kind. And my hope is that those changes will be progressive and not go the other way, which, there's potential for that as well. So those of us who are thinking about this stuff need to be standing up and saying, let's not use this as an excuse for government to send us backwards another 50 years. Let's use this as an opportunity to move forward and make life better for everyone.
That is a beautiful message, and I think what you're saying is the kids will always rise up, as they did with Woodstock. They'll rise up again, and I think beautiful sentiment, and sort of reflects you as a person and even your work. There's such a positivity in your work and the way you just the people you have in your films. It's just it's very positive. And it almost feels like it's all happening at once. And it's like, yeah, let's do this, And I think that's a great message to end on, that the kids will always rise up.
I think that's a great spot to finish with. I'm happy with that as a closing statement. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. We went everywhere pretty much, which I love.
No, I'm really happy to have had this conversation, man. I appreciate it. And, it's not often that I chat with someone about whatever for as long as we have. So, it's been a great conversation. So thank you.
Yeah. So, Aidan, is there anything you want to plug? Anything coming up? Obviously, the 2 new novels that you're writing as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, I have to. My publishers would be very upset with me if I didn't plug the books. So if you go to politicalanimalpress.com, you'll find the Woodstock book, and very shortly there'll be a pre-order link for the Jimi Hendrix book and the John Lennon book as well.
Awesome. And they can find your films through Devil Blue Films. The Devil Blues and Me is on YouTube. You can buy a copy of A Venue for the End of the World on Google Play and other things like that.
And it's been great to chat and just sort of work through some of these theories that we have. It's always fun. I'm not sure if I absolutely would stand by every statement that I've made today.
Yeah, no, it was a fantastic conversation. And thank you so much for listening. If you like the podcast and like our conversations, think about becoming a patron. Description below. You can follow me at AdamFreedom_ on Instagram and Twitter. You can subscribe to my YouTube channel, Adam Freedom, and like my Facebook page, Adam Freedom. And thank you for listening, and keep thinking about stuff.